He is one of the most powerful and influential mafia bosses in American history. Ruling a gambling empire, he is known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld, the one who has the power to change the political situation in America. That person is Frank Costello. On February 18, 1973, a quiet funeral took place at St. Michael's Cemetery in Queens, a suburb of New York. The funeral was held very simply, with only a priest reading a prayer over the coffin of the deceased, in front of the widow. No fanfare, no noise, everything happened as quickly as possible. Even the service staff could hardly imagine that the person who had just passed away was such a notorious crime boss. Even if people read the name Frank Costello, the Prime Minister, that nickname is probably enough to evoke both the authority and position of Frank Costello in the American underworld in the early 20th century. To be precise, Frank Costello was one of the most powerful bosses in American history. He even held the role of leader of the Luciano family, one of the 5 mafia families that led organized crime in New York. However, what differentiated Frank Costello at the top from other famous godfathers, according to researcher Lauren Carter, author of The Most Evil Mobsters in History, was his tendency to support the trend of nonviolent action. Costello believed that killing should only be used in truly exceptional cases, as the ultimate punishment for breaking the most sacred rules of the American Mafia. So Frank Costello focused his energies on business, especially the revenue from the slot machines, which were located throughout the city. Every day, Costello earned at least $50,000 from those machines. Of course, he didn't keep it all for himself. A large portion of it was paid to his underlings and the police and other law enforcement officers. The Prime Minister was a very reasonable person who knew how to spend money to win people's hearts. What's more, even when he had the ability to do earth-shattering things, Frank Costello became more and more patient, trying to change himself more and more, trying to shed his past to become a true gentleman, elegant, handsome, and honest. The story goes that in 1933, New York had a new mayor, Fiorello LaGuardia, a very tough guy on casino activities who went on the radio to call for throwing the useless people out of the city as a secret declaration of war, then planned and pursued the plan to eliminate the entire slot machine business. How did Frank Costello react? The Prime Minister joined the Lakesville Country Club, an elite Long Island club, playing golf, telling entertaining, and carefully crafted stories about a relatively unblemished past, and leaving no other members to guess that the storyteller was a notorious boss. Disgusted by the warehouses full of dusty slot machines under LaGuardia, Costello remained loyal to peaceful solutions. Finally, his chance came. Huey Pierce Long, a pragmatic politician, invited Costello and his slot machines to New Orleans. The price was only $40,000 for the city's charity fund, a bargain for legalizing this lucrative business again, and of course the Prime Minister agreed. Money began to flow into his coffers again. That calm and noble demeanor did not come to Frank Costello by accident. Born on January 26, 1891, in an atmosphere thick with a mixture of poverty, superstition, backwardness, and lawlessness in Calabria, southern Italy, the boy named Francesco Castiglia was brought to America by his parents in an iron pot lined with a blanket. The destination was a slum in Harlem, Manhattan, New York. At the age of 7, Francesco knew how to make money. He took on the task of lighting a stove for Jews on the Sabbath, when they had to abstain from doing this work, but instead of 1 cent as offered, he demanded 5 cents. At the age of 13, Francesco dropped out of school, went out into the streets and changed his name to Frank Costello. He stood out among the gang, quickly becoming a protector for petty thieves. It was during this time, absorbing the underground culture from the Italian, Irish, and Jewish immigrant groups, that Frank Costello learned a lesson, a motto that permeates throughout. Supporting someone is like putting money in the bank to invest. The time will come to withdraw the money. The core issue is just to choose the right investment. In 1919, Frank married the sister of his childhood friend. However, that same year he was imprisoned for 10 months for armed robbery. When he was released, Frank made a vow to renounce violence. Instead, he only used his brain to do business and survive. From then on, Frank never carried a gun with him, something that never happened in the position of a mafia boss. However, from then until 1920, when the United States officially imposed the prohibition law on the production, sale, and use of alcohol, Costello still had to gain prestige by using muscle power. But from that time on, his career in the underworld really expanded. With his intelligence, acumen, and cunning, Frank expanded his relationships to serve the illegal alcohol trade. He knew both the small-time dealers and the agents who specialized in selling the goods. He even opened specially designed bars with sophisticated warning and disposal systems. Costello never appeared before his customers in a scary appearance. His underlings took care of the dirty work, and violence was only used very sparingly. Each time, Costello approached deeper into the business community while still maintaining his influence in the criminal syndicates. He lived in a luxurious mansion near Central Park, an area of the upper class. Besides maintaining relationships with gangs in the underworld, Frank was also extremely friendly with politicians, judges, police, or anyone he felt he could take advantage of. And from there, Frank's name, Prime Minister of the Underworld, was born. The man who could solve any problem or disagreement of anyone who needed help. In his network of relationships, there were the most important figures in New York. Wall Street tycoons, politicians, judges, lawyers, journalists, famous artists, all were investments that he took care of on the side that needed to be seen by the world. On the other side, Costello cast his giant shadow over the entire criminal world. On November 4th, 1928, boss Arthur Rothstein was assassinated. The huge business was divided in half. The famous Lucky Luciano took over the drug supply business, while Costello was satisfied with the territory related to slot machines. Immediately, he showed himself to be a great organizer and earned more money than the profits from bootleg liquor. In fact, Costello had hoped to be able to divide the illegal profits throughout the United States among all the families peacefully. However, that never became a reality. In 1929, Frank, Charles, and Chicago mob boss Johnny Torrio held a meeting of all the American bosses. Known as the Big Seven Group, the meeting laid the first foundation for the establishment of the National Crime Organization of America, which ran and maintained order in the underworld. At the meeting, all agreed to change the direction of the American Mafia empire. Meanwhile, the two bosses, Salvatore Maranzano and Joe Masuria, were not invited to the Big Seven Group meeting because of their conservatism and belief in the operating system of the old Mafia empire. It was this conflict that led to the most famous Mafia civil war at that time, the Castellammarese War. Joe believed that he deserved to enjoy a dictatorship over other Mafia criminal organizations and that no one had the courage to overthrow him. With that confidence, Joe demanded a fee of $10,000 from any Mafia gang that wanted his protection in the war. This angered the Salvatore Mafia family, who decided to ally with Charles Lucky Luciano's gang to fight Joe Masuria. However, Charles and Frank had a plan all along. Instead of allying with Salvatore and leading the underworld into a long-term bloody war, Charles and Frank decided to end the war once and for all. Charles contacted Salvatore and agreed to help him overthrow Joe. And of course, they succeeded in assassinating Joe Masuria in a store just a few weeks later. In fact, Charles and Frank did not want to ally with Salvatore. They were just using him to get Joe out of the game. After Joe's death, Charles hired 2 gunmen from Murder Incorporated and shot Salvatore in his office. The complete elimination of Joe and Salvatore was successful, ending the Civil War and once again strengthening Charles and Frank's position in the underworld. After the war, Frank Costello became a member of the Lucky Luciano crime family and took over the gambling and betting establishments. Frank quickly became one of the family's top earners and was planning to install slot machines and betting machines for money in every bar, restaurant, cafe, pharmacy, and gas station in New York. However, his activities were interfered with by Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia. The market decided to abolish and throw all of Frank's slot machines into the river. At that time, Frank had to negotiate but failed. Later, Frank agreed to give 10% of the profits to Louisiana Governor Huey Long to install slot machines throughout Louisiana. Costello's decline began in the late 1940s. An ambitious boss emerged, Vito Genovese, who was determined to seize power and did not hesitate to use violence. At the same time, although he tried to consolidate his power by spending money to buy the support of politicians and lawyers, Costello still came under the attention of the law. By the early 1950s, Mr. Prime Minister was surrounded by both the law enforcement agencies and the faction of Vito Genovese, who took advantage of the situation. On October 4, 1951, Willie Moretti, a close ally of Costello, was shot dead. In 1952, Costello was sentenced to 18 months in prison for contempt of the Senate. In 1953, having just been released 4 months early for good behavior, Costello was sued by the Federal Internal Revenue Service for tax evasion. The legal battles dragged on into the early 1960s, when Costello was 70 years old. During that time, when he was constantly in and out of his cell, Vito made his move. With ambitions to become the leader of the gang, Vito Genovese decided to kill Frank. The order to kill the boss was given to Vincent Giganti, a captain of the gang and very loyal to Vito. On the evening of May 2, 1957, Frank returned home after enjoying dinner with his wife and a few friends. As the taxi drove Frank to his apartment near Central Park, and the boss walked to the front door, a black Cadillac slowly pulled up to the curb behind it. As Frank entered the lobby of the building, a shot rang out. Stumbling into the lobby, Frank fell onto the leather sofa while a gunman ran out of the lobby and jumped into the waiting Cadillac. The bullet only grazed Frank's skull and he survived the assassination attempt. The police asked Frank to describe the killer, but Frank repeatedly told them that he had not had a good look at the killer. He even claimed that he had not heard the gunshot. The doorman in the lobby of the building described the gunman as a man 6 feet tall with a stocky build. The New York Police Department dispatched 66 detectives to the scene, and the doorman soon identified Vincent Giganti as the killer. The police arrested Vincent Giganti and brought him to trial in 1958. However, even with the doorman's testimony, prosecutors could not convict him because boss Frank claimed he could not identify the attacker. As a result, the court found Vincent innocent. Reporters said that after the judge announced his sentence, Vincent whispered, "Thank you, Frank." After the trial, Frank understood Vito's ambition and decided to leave the gang and become a florist. However, his influence in the New York Mafia was still so great that many people called him the Prime Minister of the Underworld. Many Mafia figures often visited his apartment to consult on gang matters. Frank died in February 1973 after a heart attack. Anyway, that is probably an acceptable peaceful ending for a boss who understands the law, does not abuse power, knows his limits, respects compromises, and increasingly distances himself from violence, like Frank Costello.
Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed the content. And as always, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments below. See you in the next one.